In this video, we'll create a complete HTML and CSS website with Bootstrap 4. Alright, so let's take a look at the website at its full width, and then in a few minutes we'll see how it looks on cell phones. So let's go ahead and start from the top with the logo off to the left, and then we have the Bootstrap navigation off to the right here, and when we hover over the navigation menu items, we're going to see that they're going to be highlighted in black and with an underline, and then as we work our way down the page, you'll see that it's going to act as a sticky navigation or sticky header where it stays fixed until we get down to a certain point of the website where it scrolls up with the rest of the content. Then moving down the page, the next section is the image slider where we're going to add this content over top of it, including the Start Course button. And at the bottom we have the carousel indicators so we can transition through the different slides. And then underneath the image slider we have what's called a Jumbotron section here in Bootstrap, where it's the highlighted gray background color. And inside of the Jumbotron, I'm going to take advantage of the space here and advertise my full Bootstrap Udemy course. So if you were to select that button, it will take you to my course. Okay, so moving on down the page, the next section will be where it says create a complete website. And we're going to have a heading and then paragraph text underneath that, followed by this 3-column section where we have the latest Font Awesome icons, which they just came out with, the Bootstrap icon that you see there. And while we're designing the website, I'll show you where to add your own Font Awesome icons. Then moving down the page after the horizontal separator, we have this heading, text, and button taking up half of the page. And then we have a photo on the right hand side taking up the other half. And then as we scroll down, we'll get to the fixed image background section, which will work on mobile devices including the iPhone. And underneath that we have another section where it's going to be an image taking up half of the page with the heading, text, and button on the right. Then beneath that we have another horizontal separator followed by the Connect With Us section where we have the social media buttons, and you can also add the social media buttons to the footer down here where we have the 3-column section, and then the socket underneath that where it has the horizontal line and the copyright symbol at the bottom with the domain name. Okay, so now that we've seen the entire website at its full width, let's scroll back up to the top of it and see how the website reacts when we flex the browser window down and see where the breakpoints are. So we're going to use the Bootstrap grid to take advantage of their breakpoints, but we're also going to add our own custom media queries. So as you can see with the content sitting on top of the image slider, it's going to break at the 992 mark, the 768 mark, and the 576 mark. And the Bootstrap navigation menu will change and expand at the 768 mark, which, as you may know with Bootstrap, it's the medium screen width, but we'll get to the different widths and breakpoints later in the video. So moving on down the website, we'll see that this 3-column section is going to shift into 2 columns for the first 2, and then a full width column centering the last one. And then when we get down to the 576 pixel mark, it's going to turn into a complete single column website for mobile phones and maybe small tablets, for example. So the 2-column sections at the bottom will go from 2 columns to a single column at the 992 large screen width, as well as the Jumbotron, but the rest will mainly shift at the 768 pixel medium screen width. So don't get overwhelmed with all of the different column widths and breakpoints right now. It's going to turn out to be really simple with Bootstrap as we work through the tutorial. So in the description of this video will be a direct download for the Bootstrap site starter files, which you'll need to build this website. So inside of the starter files download will be the index.html and style.css files. I'm going to be using the free program called Sublime Text that you see in the background there as my text editor. And I'm going to have index.html open with Google Chrome as we're building the website. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up in Google Chrome. And then as you can see, in order to promote my Bootstrap Udemy course, I've already included the Jumbotron section of the website for us inside of the starter files, minus a little bit of styling to reduce the padding, which we'll get to later in the video. Then moving back to the starter files download, aside from index.html and style.css, we'll have an image folder that will include all of the images used throughout the tutorial. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and move over to Sublime Text and go over what's already included for us inside of index.html and style.css with the starter files. So here, the first thing that will jump out will be the Jumbotron section where I mentioned links to my course from the original website right there, which we'll style later. And aside from that, the rest of the content here will just be for the head section and some comments laying out the structure of our website. So let's start from the top with the doc type HTML, and then we have the HTML tag where it specifies the language, and that's going to be in English, spanning the whole document there. And then at the top inside of the head section, we have a standard UTF-8 character set, viewport with device width initial scale 1 for mobile devices, the title of our website, Bootstrap 4 website, then the latest version of Bootstrap min.css, and that's 4.3.1 as of now when I'm making this video. And then we have the latest version of jQuery 3.3.1, and then we have the 4.3.1 of Bootstrap min.js, and then underneath that we have the most recent version of Font Awesome, which was just released, which is 5.8.1, and that's going to allow us to add the icons that you see here for the HTML, Bootstrap, and CSS3, and then the social media icons at the bottom of the website as well. And then moving back to index.html, the last part of our head section will be the link to our style sheet that we're going to get to in a moment. You might consider actually adding that above the reference of the JS files so it gets to the CSS files first. So as I said, aside from the Jumbotron content, the rest will just be comments laying out the different sections of our website, so we can just plug the HTML in right underneath those invisible comments. So moving over to style.css, the first thing that we have up top will be a Google font that I've added here called Montserrat, and you can get your own Google font if you just do a quick Google search for Google fonts, and then you can add the different font weights where we have the 400, 500, and 700 for the different weights. And then we have the font family declared, the color, which is going to be a little bit of a off black, sort of dark gray color for the text. And then to make sure that the website spans 100% width and 100% height of our web browsers, we'll have a little reset style there saying that we have the height and width set to 100%. So down here we have the start of our media queries already laid out for us for the different breakpoints, the large, medium, and small screen widths that you see shifting right there with the content on top of the image slider. And then down here we have a little cheat sheet for the different breakpoints for the Bootstrap columns that you see here as one of the image slides. And that's going to show us where the medium screen width, large screen width, for example, take place at their pixel values. And then scrolling all the way to the bottom let's start with the Firefox Bug Fix up top there. So with Firefox, there's a little bug with the Bootstrap slider. I'm not sure if it's fixed yet because I'm in Google Chrome, but when the images slide, there might be a little bit of white space off to the sides. So watch for that if you're on Firefox, but they may have corrected it with the latest version. And then we have a little bit of additional padding added to the Bootstrap columns by default. I think that they lack a little bit of padding in their default design between columns, so I add that. And then for the fixed background image, to make sure that it displays properly for us on cell phones, particularly iPhones and iPads with iOS, we have some style already included for us there, including the addition of the actual background image from the starter files. And so you can add your own image there with that image URL if you want to use your own fixed background image. And once we add the HTML for this part of the website later, the image is going to display for us automatically. Okay, so let's go back to index.html and drop down underneath the navigation comment so we can get started with our Bootstrap nav bar. Now let's go back over to Sublime Text and get started just underneath the navigation comment. So we'll start off with the standard nav tag, and then we're going to give this a class. I'm just going to shift this over so we don't have to see the image slider constantly going. And we're going to use the Bootstrap navbar class here, and then we're going to say navbar-expand-md for medium screen width. So basically what we're saying is since Bootstrap starts at a single column width and then expands from there, once we get up to 768 pixels or the medium screen width, the menu is going to change from the drop-down menu to the full width menu. All right, and then now that we've added that class, let's go ahead and set the colors for the navigation. So we're going to use the light navbar, so we're just going to say navbar-light, and then BG-light for background light. So this is going to give us the white background with the dark colored text as opposed to navbar dark, which would be a dark background with light colored text. And then to make it sticky, we're just going to use the sticky-top class here. If you want it fixed, you can just use fixed-top, but as we saw, we're going to use the sticky class. Okay, so now let's go ahead and set a container. So we're going to use container fluid. So the navbar expands the full width of the browser window rather than staying at a set width with just div class container. So we're going to say div class container-fluid. And then we can drop down and close out the div. And I'm not going to nest these the div inside of the nav tag there with an indent, as we can see the start of our navbar up there, because we're going to have a number of different indentations, starting with the navbar brand class, so we can add the logo. So we're going to say a class navbar-brand. Since the logo is going to act as a link, we'll use the anchor tag with a, and then we're going to say href, and we'll just link this back to the index.html page. And then inside of the actual anchor tag, we're going to add our image for the logo. So that's going to be inside of the img folder. So we'll say img / to go into the folder. And then the logo is just going to be bootstrap.png. Okay, so go ahead and add the logo file name. And then let's go back and refresh the browser, and there we have the Bootstrap logo displaying. And as you can see there, the logo is too big. It's actually going to be half the size as the image once we resize it with the CSS. And the reason being is for high resolution devices like phones, you want the logo to be twice the size that it's going to display at. So let's add some padding around the logo before we resize it in style.css. So let's reference the navbar class itself, and we'll just give it a padding all around of 0.8 rem. And if you're not familiar with the rem sizing, 1 rem is the equivalent of 16 pixels, which is the default font size for Google Chrome, for example. So 0.8 rem is about, let's just say 13 pixels or so. Okay, so now that we have the padding added, let's go ahead and resize the navbar brand image. So we'll say .navbar-brand to target that class with the period. rather than a hashtag for an ID. And then we're going to say height to rem, which is the equivalent of 32 pixels. So the image originally is 64 pixels in height, and now at 32, it's half the size. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add the drop-down menu button for the navigation before we can actually add the unordered list containing the list items and links inside of them for the navigation links. Okay, so let's move back over to index.html and drop down underneath the A tag, and we're going to create a button here. And we're going to give this button a class called navbar-toggler, which is the standard class for the drop-down button with Bootstrap menus. And then we're going to give this a type button, and then we're going to say data-toggle collapse. So Bootstrap.js is going to take care of the opening and collapsing of the navigation using this button with the addition of data toggle collapse. And then what we're going to need to do is set a target for the toggle. So we're going to say data-target, and then we're going to use an ID here that will eventually give to the actual div for the navigation right here that the unordered list will be inside of. So we're going to say data-target. And since it's an ID we're going to use a hashtag to reference the ID, and we're just going to call that navbar responsive with a capital R in responsive. So now we can start to see the button forming, but we'll need to add the lines that appear inside of it. So we're going to use a span class for that, just called navbar toggler icon. And that's going to give us the hamburger menu appearance. So once we refresh, there we have the hamburger displaying inside of the actual Bootstrap navbar toggler. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get started on the actual navigation. So we're going to start that off with a div class before we add the unordered list that will open and collapse. So we're going to say div class collapse and then navbar-collapse, and then we can add the ID that we just referenced for the button. So we're going to say ID, and we can leave out the hashtag since this is the actual ID, and we're just going to say navbar responsive with the capital R, and then let's drop down and close out the div, and inside of that we can get started with the unordered list. So we'll say UL class, and then navbar-nav, which is standard for the Bootstrap menu unordered list. And then to position our menu off to the right, we're going to use ml-auto. So if you want it centered, you would use mx-auto. If you want it off to the left, you would use mr-auto. All right, and then let's drop down and close out the unordered list. And then let's add our first list item. So we're going to say li class nav-item. And then we can drop down and add our link. And the first one is going to be the home link, and it's going to be active, as we can see there, because we're on the home page. So we're going to say a class nav-link, and then we'll add the active class. And then similar to the logo, our link here for the home menu button, or home menu link at least, will link us back to the index.html file. So we're going to say href index.html for our link, or you can just do a hashtag if you want, which won't send you anywhere. And then we'll just write home and close out the A tag. So now if we go and refresh, there we have our first link displaying for us. And as you can see, it's already displaying in the black color for us because it's active, while the rest of the links that we add without the active class will display in a gray shade. So let's go ahead and add the next list item, and we can just paste it in here. And I'm just going to remove the active class and the link and make it a hashtag. And since we have 4 additional links, or well, 3 after this one, let's go ahead and just paste this in. And then we can add the name for the links. So it'll be About Us, Portfolio, Blog, and Contact. So About Us, Portfolio, Blog, and Contact. Okay, and I'll go ahead and save it. And now, as you can see, we have the gray links showing there with the default navbar light, and then they're black when we hover over them. Now let's go ahead and style our navigation links so they look like the finished version here with the underline, and we have some additional spacing in between them. So let's start off with the spacing in between the list items. So to reference the list item, we'll want to reference the navbar nav and then the li. So we're going to say .navbar-nav and then li. And that class, if you're wondering, is just above the list items, which is for the unordered list. And we're just going to add some padding off to the right of our list items to space them out a little bit more because it's kind of compact with the default navbar. So we're going to say padding right 0.8 rem, and then let's go ahead and refresh. And actually the finished version I think has a little bit more, so let's change that to 1.1 rem, which is about 18 pixels or so. Okay, so that looks pretty good before we change the size of our nav links. So let's go ahead and reference the class for the actual link, which will be nav-link. So we'll say .nav-link to reference the class. And then let's give it a font size of 1.1 rem and refresh. And there we have them looking just like the original, except for they're a little bit more bold in the finished version. So let's take advantage of that 500 font weight with the Montserrat font. And we're going to say font weight 500. And that's going to look a little bit more bold. And now it's matching up perfectly aside from the border on the bottom with that purple Bootstrap shade. So let's go ahead and target the hover and active states for that class. So we'll see the border only when we hover over the links and for the active class. So we're going to say .nav-link :hover, comma, .nav-link .active for the home active link where we have the class right here. All right, and then to add the border, let's go ahead and just say border-bottom and 0.1 rem solid, and then the hex value for the purple shade that we'll use a couple times throughout the theme is going to be hashtag 563D71. All right, now let's go ahead and save it. And there we have the border on the bottom of our active and the links that we hover over. And there we have the border on the mobile version as well. So that does it for our navigation. Now let's go ahead and drop down to the image slider next. So as we saw earlier in the video, for the Bootstrap carousel or image slider, we're going to use these carousel indicators to transition through the different image slides rather than using previous and next buttons, which I kind of like it. I think it looks a little bit cleaner. So let's drop down underneath the image slider comment here. And let's get started with our div ID. So we're going to say div ID slides, and we'll reference that in just a moment. And then we're going to say class carousel, which is standard for the Bootstrap image slider. And then to get the carousel images sliding, we're going to use the slide class. And then we're going to say data-ride carousel for Bootstrap.js to give us the carousel function. And then underneath that, we're going to add our unordered list. We're going to add the carousel indicators first before we add the actual slides. So that's, as I said, going to be the 3 buttons at the bottom. So we're going to say ul class carousel-indicators. And then each indicator is going to be a list item that we slide to and from. So let's close out the unordered list, and then we'll say li, and then data target. And similar to the navigation drop-down menu opening up an ID, the data target here is going to reference the div ID that we gave for the actual image slider itself. So we're going to say data target hashtag for the ID slides, and then data-slide-2, because we need this to slide to a particular slide. And then the first one is going to be class active, and then we can close out the list item. So the data slide to numbers, the first is always going to start with 0, and then it will add up from there. So now what we'll need to do is add the rest of our list items for the other 2 slides. So we can do away with the class active, and then the next one will be data slide to 1, and then the third will be data slide to 2. Okay. Alright, so now let's go ahead and add the Carousel Inner class, which will contain our carousel items, where our images will be. So let's drop down underneath the unordered list, and we'll say div class carousel-inner, and then drop down and close out the div, and then inside of that we'll have our first carousel item, which will be the pink clouds image here. So we're going to say div class carousel-item, and then the first one will be active. All right, and then let's add the actual image. So the first image with the clouds will be inside of the image folder, as we know, and then it will just be clouds.png. All right. And then before we add the carousel caption, which is the content sitting on top of that first image slider image, which is displaying here, let's go ahead and add the other 2 images. So we have the purple Bootstrap image there, and then the Bootstrap 12-column grid system image. So we can go ahead and just copy this carousel item div class and paste it in underneath, and we'll just want to remove the active class. Okay, and then let's change the images to the Bootstrap-banner image, and then the grid.png image. So for the second one, it's Bootstrap-banner, and then grid.png. Okay, so now if we go ahead and refresh, we can slide to and from all of the different images. And if we let it sit for a second, it's going to transition to the next. So the one thing that you'll notice though right now is the images aren't taking up the full screen if we size the browser window up, and if we size it down, it's not going to flex down with the screen either. So what we'll want to do is reference the Carousel Inner class and then the image inside of it. And we're going to say carousel-inner image, and then we're going to give it a width of 100%. That way the image will always stay at 100% of the browser window, no matter how wide or narrow the screen is, as we can see here, and it will flex with the screen. Okay, so now that we have the width set at 100% and we have the images added, let's go ahead and add the content that sits on top of the first carousel image. And I should say that even though we're just adding content over top of the first image, you can use the same method to add content over the rest of your images. So let's drop down underneath the image source for the first carousel item, and we're going to start a new class that we're going to say or call CarouselCaption. And then we can close out the div, and inside of this is where we're going to add our heading. And the first one is going to be a heading 1 that we're going to call Bootstrap 4. And there we have the first bit of our content displaying with the heading 1. And then underneath that we'll have a heading 3 where it says responsive HTML website. So H3 responsive HTML website. And then the last bit of content will be the Start Course button that appears underneath that. So we'll say ahref, and I'll just leave the link blank, and then we'll say class, and then all Bootstrap buttons will start with the BTN class. And before we add the other class, if you want to learn more about Bootstrap buttons, just do a search for it, and you can see all the different pre-styled Bootstrap button classes that they have. So we're going to use the BTN outline light button. So let's go ahead and add that class here. So it's going to be BTN-outline-light. And that's going to give us sort of a hollow button with the white text and outline. And then we're going to use a large button. They have small, medium, large, and extra large. So we'll use the large, and then we can just type in the content that we want inside of the button where it says Start Course. So now if we go and refresh, there we have our heading 1, heading 3, and the Start Course button. So now we'll move over to style.css and add the style and positioning of our carousel caption content. So the first thing that we'll reference will be that class, the carousel caption class that we see right here. So we can position the content in the middle of the page on top of the background image. So let's go over to style.css and we'll say .carousel-caption to reference that class. And then we want this to have absolute positioning. That way the element will stay fixed inside of its parent element rather than fixed for the whole browser window. And then what we'll do is once we add position absolute, we're going to say transform translate y for the y-axis, meaning vertical, and -50%. Okay, so transform translate y will allow us to center the element on the page, but as you can see right here, it's only going to add half the height of the element itself underneath it, and we'll need to take care of the rest of the positioning to center it. So to have it absolutely centered, we could say top 50%, but we're going to have it 47% from the top so we can make up for some space that the carousel indicators have underneath the content towards the bottom of the image slider. So it's kind of centered in between the carousel indicators and the nav bar. So now let's go ahead and style our headings, and then we'll take care of a little bit of button styling. So we'll reference the heading 1, but first let's start with carousel-caption and then H1. And let's increase the font size to 4.5 rem. All right. So that looks good, except for if we toggle back and forth, we'll see that the finished version has a lighter font weight. And since the lightest we have with the Google font we added is 400, let's go ahead and take advantage of a class with Bootstrap called Display-2. So I think they have Display-1 up to Display-5, 1 being the largest and 5 being the smallest. And that's going to give us a lightweight, similar to the finished version there. And then let's go ahead and add text transform uppercase to make all of the characters uppercase because we didn't do that in the HTML. And then let's add the text shadow. So we'll say 0.1 rem horizontal, 0.1 rem vertical, and then a radius of 1 rem. And then we'll just make it black. Or you can do a dark gray, that might look good also. Okay, so now we have the heading 1 matching up to the original. So let's drop down to the heading 3 text where it says responsive HTML website. So once again, we'll reference basically the same styles here, customization. So we can just paste it in and we'll change that to 3 rem. We can do away with the uppercase. And then let's leave the text shadow the same except for making the radius 0.6 rem. And that looks good and like the original, but we'll want to add some additional space underneath the heading 3. So let's say padding dash bottom 1 rem to leave some space before the Bootstrap button. So that looks good, except for once we get down to the button, let's go ahead and make the font weight a little bolder. And we'll just do this to all of our buttons. So we can reference the btn class rather than the btn ashdown outline light just to target this button. So we'll say btn font weight 500, similar to what we did with the navigation, which I believe is 400 by default. And then we'll say border width medium to make the border a little more bold itself rather than a thin border. Okay, so now if we transition back and forth from the original, we won't be able to tell the difference. Okay, so everything looks good until we get down to the Jumbotron. So since all of the HTML content for the Jumbotron is already filled out for us here, all we need to do is go over to style.css. And what we're going to do is reduce the padding. Bootstrap, for some reason, adds a lot of padding to the Jumbotron by default. So we're just going to reference the class for the Jumbotron, which can be seen next to the row class right here. So let's go ahead and target that class by saying .jumbotron. And then we're just going to give it padding all around of 1 rem. And then by default, it might be hard to see here, but Bootstrap also adds some border radius to the Jumbotron's corners. So we're going to go ahead and just say border radius 0. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and save it, and you probably won't be able to see here, at least on video, the change in the border radius, but at least we can see that the padding matches up now to the original with the spacing there. So let's drop down to the next section, which starts with the create a complete website heading and then the paragraph underneath that. And then after the welcome section is complete, we'll get to the 3-column section. So let's drop down underneath the welcome section comment, and let's get started with our first div class, which will be the container fluid class. And then inside of that we'll have a row. So we'll say div class row, and we're going to use columns that don't take up the full width. So to center our columns, what we're going to do is we're going to use a class with Bootstrap called justify-content center. And that's going to center our column even though it doesn't take up the full width. And then we'll use text center to center our text. And then we can drop down and close out the div. And for the The column, we're going to make it different widths at different screen widths. So we're going to say col-md-11. So we're going to use up 11 of the 12 Bootstrap columns available to us. So we'll have about a half column on either side. So with the Bootstrap grid system, as we know, one full column, so col-12 would be a full width, and then col-11 is 11/12 of the full width. And then once we size the screen up past the large screen mark, we're going to use 9 of the 12 columns available to us. So I think that looks nice when the content displays at a wider width on smaller screens, and then it stays centered but limited in width on larger screens. So let's go ahead and add the heading 1 now, and that's going to be inside of a h1 class that we're going to call display 5. So if you remember from the image slider content, we use display 2, and that's going to give us sort of a lightweight feel for our text. So there we have the heading 1. And then before we add the paragraph content, let's take care of some margin here above the heading 1. So I think that there's more spacing for the finished version. So we're going to use margin top, or MT-4. So that 4 number right there, the spacing for that, so if we go over to utilities in Bootstrap and then spacing, with 4, that's going to be 1.5 rem in spacing, and we can go up to 3 rem with MT5. Alright, so let's go ahead and see. I can't really tell the difference here, but anyways, we'll be referencing that later, adding additional padding and margin throughout the website. So let's go ahead and move down to the paragraph text underneath that, and we're also going to use a Bootstrap class for this paragraph text to make it lightweight. So that's going to be p-class lead, and then I'll just save some time and paste the paragraph content in here. And now if we go ahead and save it, there we have our heading 1 and paragraph text inside of the col medium screen width 11 columns and large screen width 9 columns. So now let's drop down to the 3 column section underneath that, where it says 3 column section. And once again, we'll start it off with a div class container fluid, and then inside of that we'll have div class row, and all of our text is going to be centered in this section as well. So we'll use the text center class where Bootstrap takes care of that for us. And then for our columns here, if we size down the screen, we'll see that they're going to go from a single column, and then once we get to the 576 pixel mark, it's going to turn into a 2 column layout. So if we divide 2 into 12, we get 6. So we'll say col-sm for small screen widths, and then 6. And once we get up to medium screen widths, it's going to turn into the 3 column layout. So if we divide 3 into 12, we get 4. So that's going to be col-md-4. Alright, then we can drop down and close out the div for our columns, or for our column in this case. And let's start off with the Font Awesome icon. So if you want to add your own icon, just do a quick Google search for Font Awesome icons, and then you'll get the class for the particular icon you want to use. In this case, it's FA-HTML5 after the FAB. And there we have it displaying right down there, which we'll resize in just a little bit. But first, let's add our heading that appears underneath of that, and then the paragraph text. So we'll add the HTML5 text inside of a heading 3. And then underneath that, inside of our paragraph text, we'll have it say built with the latest version of HTML, HTML5. Okay, so there we have our content, and if we size the screen down, we can see that it's already transitioning from the 3-column to the 2-column and single column widths. And now what we can do to save some time, since the content for these other columns are really similar, is let's go ahead and just copy the HTML5 column here and paste it underneath for the Bootstrap column and the CSS column. So now let's go ahead and change the icon for the Bootstrap one from HTML5 to Bootstrap. And then I'll change the heading 3 text for the Bootstrap section. And I'm just going to make this uppercase here so we don't have to style it with transform uppercase later in the CSS. And I'll say Bootstrap, comma, Bootstrap 4. And then we'll change the CSS text here. And the icon for this, rather than just being CSS3, that's going to be different from this one. So this one is actually CSS3-alt. All right, and now let's go ahead and save it. And there we have all of our columns displaying. And if we size it down, one thing that we'll notice is the CSS3 column, we don't need the half screen width there. So we're going to go ahead and do away with that. And once we do that, it's going to be centered for us. Okay, so that looks good. Okay, so now that we have all of our columns displaying properly, let's go ahead and style the icons. So we'll reference the HTML5 icon first, and we'll want to target the FA-HTML5 class. So that's the class right here. And we'll style each of them individually so we can give them different colors. So we'll say .fa-HTML5, and then let's increase the font size to 5 rem. And that looks good, except for it's a little too close to the heading 3. So let's go ahead and add some padding. So we'll say padding 1 rem. Okay. And whoops, actually we'll want to use margin. So the spacing goes outward rather than inward. Okay, so that looks good. And then to color it in that orange shade, let's go ahead and add a hex value for that orange color with the color. So we'll say color E54D26, which is the hex value. Okay, so there we have it. And then since the style for the rest of these icons will be really similar to the first, let's go ahead and just copy this and paste it. And then we can change the HTML5 text to Bootstrap and CSS3-alt. Okay, so now if we save, they're all going to be the same relative size and color. So now what we'll do is we'll just change the hex values to match the purple and blue shades that we're seeing there. So for the purple shade, I'm going to use that same hex value that was used earlier for the purple in the navigation. And then for the blue, that's going to be 2163AF. Okay. So that looks good, except for, I think the purple. Oh no, that matches, that's right. I thought that that was a different purple shade. Okay, so the 3-column section looks good, so let's drop down to the next section. So before we lay out this 2-column section, let's just add this horizontal rule that gives us the page sort of separation there. So that's going to be HR class my-4. So Bootstrap has a class called my4 that will add that horizontal line for us, which we see right there. And that's all we need to do. We don't need to add any styling to that. So let's move on to the 2-column section just underneath the comment for it. And we'll say div class container fluid. And then inside of that we'll have our row. And then since this is a 2-column section, if we divide 2 into 12, we get 6. And we're going to have this transition to the mobile version at the large screen width, which is 992 pixels. So we'll use col-LG for large and then 6 because it's a 2-column layout. Okay, and then if we close out the div, let's go ahead and just copy this and paste it underneath because they're both going to be the same col-LG 6. Alright, so let's add the heading text first where it says websites made easy. So we'll put this inside of a heading too, and we're going to give it a class to add some additional padding underneath it. So we're going to say padding bottom, or PB-3, and then underneath that we'll add our paragraph text for the first bit of paragraph text here, for the first sentence I should say, and then we'll add our next paragraph section, and then the last one. And you can just use dummy text, I should say, Ipsum text if you want, so you don't have to type everything out right now. And then underneath the paragraph text, now that we've added the heading and paragraph, as we see here, we can add the button. So this button is going to be similar to the button that we used inside or on top of the image slider. It's going to be an outline button. So we'll say ahref class btn, and then instead of btn outline light, we're just going to use btn outline dash dark. And then I'll just write the learn more text in there. And then let's go ahead and take a look at it here in Google Chrome. Alright, so once we refresh, that looks good. And let's go ahead and add the image that sits off to the right now. So we can drop down to the next div class col-LG6, and we're going to say image source and then image /, and that image file name is just going to be woman.jpg or JPEG. Alright, and then let's save it. And it's displaying way too big at the full dimensions of the image. So what we could do is we could add an image class called img-fluid, but what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to say image max width 100%, so we don't have to reference image fluid several times. But actually, now that I think of it, if your image is smaller than the column, you might want to add img/fluid as a class to make it take up the full width, or you can add min width 100% in addition to max width. So one thing that you might notice with the finished version of the website is there's some additional spacing around the 2-column sections here. So let's add some vertical and horizontal margin. So next to the row class, we're going to say my-5 for the y-axis vertically, and that's going to give us some margin of 3 rem on the top and bottom. And then for the x-axis horizontally, we're going to say mx-3, so that's going to give us a horizontal margin of 1.5 rem on either side. Okay, so now it's looking like the original, except that button, there's a little bit more space underneath the paragraph text in the finished version there. So we can add, say, like PT2 or something, but I'll just add a line break to add the spacing there. Alright, so now moving on to the fixed background image section. As we learned early on in the video when we went over the style included for us with the starter files, we saw that all of the style for this section is already added here. So all we'll need to do is reference the figure tag, the fixed wrap class, and the fixed ID, and then you can always change the background image to your image of preference if you wish. So let's go ahead and add the figure tag here, and then we'll say div class fixed dash wrap, and then inside of that div we'll have div ID fixed. Okay. And then you can always add content to this if you wish. Just make sure that you have positive Z index so it displays on top of the image. So there we have our background image displaying. We're not going to see too much of it because we don't have any content underneath it yet, but let's go ahead and take care of that by adding the next of our two column sections. So this is going to be really similar to the first, and to save some time here, let's go ahead and add the horizontal rule first, the line across the page, and then we'll add the two column section here from the one that we just laid out a moment ago. Alright, so in this case we'll have the image on the left and then the text and heading on the right. And then let's just change the image to desk.jpg for that image that appears there. And then let's change the website made easy, or websites made easy text to learn theme design, and I'm going to leave the period in there, and that's how maybe we can distinguish the finished version from the version we're working on here in Chrome. Alright, and then if we size it down, there we have the two column sections displaying for us properly at, say, an iPad or large cell phone width. Okay, so now let's drop down underneath the line that we added to start the Connect with Us section. So let's go ahead and drop down underneath the Connect comment there, and we're going to say div class container fluid. And then, as you may have guessed, we're going to add a div class row inside of that, and we're also going to say text center. And we're going to have the Connect with Us text inside of a heading 2 tag. So I'm going to say h2 connect with us, and then what we're going to find is if this heading 2 text isn't inside of a column inside of the row, it's not going to be centered. So what we'll need to do is add a column, and adding a full width column, for example, is also going to give us some additional spacing around the heading 2, which will look nice because of the inherent padding, in addition to the additional padding in the style.css sheet of 1 rem. So there we have our centered Connect with Us text with the padding from the col-12 class, which takes up the full screen. So now let's go ahead and drop down and add our social media buttons. So let's add another div class col-12, and then in addition to that, we're going to add a class here that isn't related to Bootstrap, but just so we can target the social icons, we're just going to say social as the class here. Alright, and then once we're underneath that, we can add our link, which will wrap around the Font Awesome icon. So I'm just going to leave the link blank for now with the hashtag. And then we'll just say target underscore blank, so it opens up in a new page when somebody clicks on your social media icon. And then for the Font Awesome icon, they're all going to start with FABFA dash. So what we can do is once we close out the I tag, we'll just copy this and paste it 3 more times for each one of our 4 social media icons. And now that we have them added, let's go ahead and grab our social media links. So I'm just going to real quick go to each one of my social media pages here with it sped up and add the social media page, and then I'll add its relative social media name for the icon, in this case Facebook. So if we go ahead and save it and refresh, there we have the first icon, which opens up the page in a new tab in our web browser. So let's go ahead and add the rest of the social media icons. Alright, so I'll paste the Twitter link and then add FA-Twitter. And then the next one is Instagram. So I'll paste that link in and then add FA-Instagram. And then the last one is YouTube. So I'll add the long form link for my channel here. And let me X out of these. And now if we go and refresh, there we have all 4 of the social media icons displaying before we add some custom style to them to get them appearing like this. So let's go ahead and do that now by moving over to style.css. And what we'll want to reference underneath the image style here will be the social class. So that's the class that we gave right here along with the column. And then we'll reference the link, which wraps around the icon. So we're going to say .social a, and then let's give it the font size for the icon. So let's make it 4 rem, about 4 times the size. Alright, so that looks good, and then we'll want to spread them apart. So let's go ahead and add some padding. And rather than doing padding right, for example, we'll just do padding all around of 3 rem. Alright, and now if we go and save it, there we have the spacing, which is the same as the finished version, but you can change around the size and the spacing if you wish. And then let's go ahead and add the gray shade before we add the hover color with the purple. So we're going to go ahead and say color, and this gray shade is going to be the hex value 85888C. Alright, so now if we refresh, there we have the gray shade rather than the blue default link color. And now let's add the hover color. So we'll say social a colon hover. And let's use that same purple hex value we've been using for the Bootstrap colors. Alright. And that actually looks a little darker, so I messed up the hex value. So let me just correct that. So it's going to be 6648B1. Okay, so that looks good. It's a couple of shades lighter with that same purple that we've been using, I think. Alright, so that does it for the Connect with Us section. So let's move down to the footer section, which will be the last portion of the HTML for the website. So let's drop down underneath the comment where it says footer and start it off with div class container fluid, and then close out the div, and inside of that we'll have a row, and we're going to make all of our text center. And then since we're going to have 3 columns, we'll use col MD4 because 4 goes into 12 3 times, and it's going to be responsive at the medium screen width at 768 pixels. Alright. And then let's start with the first bit of our content once we close out the div where it says contact us. So that's going to be inside of a heading 5. So we'll just write H5 and then contact us. And then underneath that we're going to use a horizontal rule, and we're going to give this a class that we're just going to call border, and then we'll style that later. And then underneath that we're going to have a number of different paragraphs. So I'm just going to go ahead and add the paragraphs here before actually pasting the stuff in, because then we can reuse the same colMD4 column as a whole for the rest of them. So I'll just go ahead and copy this and then paste it twice underneath for the rest of the footer content. And now we can go ahead and just customize the title, or the headings rather, and then the paragraph content. So this is just going to be our hours, and then the third one will be service area. And if we save it, there we have the start of our content, and the horizontal rule is already showing for us, but we'll want to make it white in color later. So let's go ahead and add the paragraph content here. So I'm just going to do some copying and pasting real quick. So I'll just add the phone number and then the email address, which that's not actually a proper email address for my website, I should say. And then 100 street name, and then the city, state, zip we can add a number of times, because that's all that's going to be included for the service area column here. And then lastly, let's take care of the hours. So I'll just paste in the Monday to Friday, which I forgot. It just says Monday. So they're only open Monday, Saturday, Sunday. And then we'll paste the Sunday in, and then get rid of the last paragraph tag. Okay, so that does it for all of the content. For the footer, we'll add the socket, which is the content at the very, very bottom later. But first, let's go over to style.css and take care of some of the styling for the footer section of the website. So we'll want to reference, actually we forgot to add the footer tag. So just before the content or container fluid div class rather, I'm just going to add a standard footer tag to wrap around it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give the footer tag the background color. So we could just add a class to go with the container fluid, but that's okay. So we're going to say footer background color 3F, 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 which is that gray shade that we see displaying now. It's kind of like a soft medium gray. And then let's go ahead and take care of the color of all the text. So we're going to make this a really light gray, so it's not quite like a bright white, with D5, D5, D5. And that's actually going to take care of the horizontal rule for us. And then let's add some padding here also. So let's add some padding to the top. So we'll say 2.5 rem. And then padding bottom 2 rem. So it'll be about 40 pixels on the top and 32 on the bottom. Okay, so that looks good, except for that horizontal rule is kind of wide. So let's go ahead and narrow that by referencing that border class that we added to it. So we're just going to say hr.border, and then let's give it a width. So we're going to say width 75%. And then it should already stay center for us, which it does. So that's good. Okay, so that's all done until we get down to the socket portion of the website. So there we have the 3 columns. So the socket is where you typically see like cookies, policies, copyright info. So even though we have a copyright thing in here, you're welcome to use this design for however you please. And then, so before we add that copyright section, let's add a new column, and let's actually stay within the same row here. So we're just going to add a full width column in the same row underneath the column D4. So we'll say col-12, and then we can close that out. And then we're going to give it a horizontal rule here that we're just going to call socket. And then we'll add some text down here. Let's use a heading 5. And we'll use ampersand copy semicolon for the copyright symbol, and then w3newbie.com. Okay, so now if we go and refresh, everything looks good except for we'll want to add some custom styling to the HR class socket. We could use the border, but I want to make it wider than that 75%. So let's go ahead and just say hr.socket, and then we'll just say, we could say give it just a color, but we could also just say border top 0.1 rem solid D5, 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 and with that, if you want to change the width of the border, then you can do that. So for some reason that original version doesn't have the space off to the side, but this version does, which I like, so it looks really good. Alright, and then the last thing that we'll add for the full width style is let's add some additional padding for the socket. So let's just drop down and say padding 0.5 rem, which is 8 pixels. Okay, so now it looks good and the spacing is just like the original. So that does it for the full width version of the website. Congratulations on completing that, but we still have a little bit to do because if we size the website down, we're going to have some trouble when we transition into tablet and mobile widths. So there's just a couple of sections, namely the social icons and the content that sits on top of the image slider, which we'll spend most of our time customizing with the media queries that are already started for us inside of the starter files. Okay, so let's go ahead and move over to the media queries. And the one thing that you'll notice is the media queries are 1 pixel narrower than the breakpoints for the Bootstrap columns because they're using minimum width. So that's going to be 992 pixels and up. So what we want to do is add 991 pixels because it's going to be that and beneath. If we did 992, there would be a sort of 1 pixel overlap where the media queries that we add wouldn't take effect for 1 pixel after the Bootstrap columns take effect. So I hope that makes sense. Alright, so let's start off at the 992 pixel mark, and we can tell we're there by looking at the 2 column sections and them changing into a single width layout. Okay, so as I said before, the bulk of our media queries will be for the CarouselCaption content for the image slider. So what we can do is go ahead and just copy all of the CarouselCaption content here. So the CarouselCaption all the way down to the button. I'm just going to copy that and paste it in here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and indent this inside of the media query. And then we only need to include stuff that we're going to change inside of the media query. So for the CarouselCaption, we'll only keep the top percentage and then the font size for the heading 1 and the heading 3, just the font size in this case. And then for the button, we can do away with both of these because we're just going to adjust the font size for that. Okay, so let's go ahead and reduce the font size for the heading 1 to start down to 4 rem, and then the heading 3 down to 2.5 rem. And if we transition back and forth from the original, we'll see that they look pretty good except for we'll want to adjust the padding and the font size for the button. So to target this button individually, we're going to say CarouselCaption.btn rather than just .btn because that's going to affect all the buttons in our layout. And then we're going to say font size 1 rem, and then we're going to reduce the padding to 0.6 rem top bottom and 0.9 rem left right. And then don't forget the space in between CarouselCaption and .btn. Alright, so now if we go and refresh and we toggle back and forth, it's going to match up, except for, let's move the position of it to top 45% to make it centered before we get down to the next breakpoint, which is going to be the medium screen width at 768 pixels. So let's go ahead and we can just copy all this carousel caption content and paste it into the 767 mark. And then let's reduce this to 42% to move it closer to the top so it stays centered on the smaller screens. And then we'll say 3.2 for the heading 1 and 1.8 for the heading 3. And then for the button, let's reduce it to 0.9 rem, and then 0.8 rem left right, and 0.5 rem top bottom. And then let's see what we have here. So it looks pretty good, except for, if I can get it to stay here, at this breakpoint, the heading 3 goes to a thinner font weight. So let's say font weight 400, or so, yeah, 400 from 500. Okay, and then we'll want to change the padding underneath that. So let's say padding bottom 0.2 rem to bring the button a little bit closer to the heading 3. Whoops. Okay. And now let's go ahead and drop down to the 560 or 576 pixel mark rather. All right, so I'm just going to copy this carousel caption content once more and then paste it into the max width 575 media query. And then let's reduce this to 39%, and then we'll make the heading 1 2.2 rem, the heading 3 1.2 rem, and we can do away with the font weight and the padding bottom actually. And then for the carousel button, we'll say 0.8 rem for the font size and 0.3 top bottom, 0.5 left right. And if we take a look at the finished version, the border for the button has reduced to the thin border, back to the default border width. So we'll say border width thin. All right, so that looks good. And then lastly, for the carousel, on the finished version, we've done away with the carousel indicator. So I'll leave that up to you. When you get down to a really small screen width, you want all the size on top of the image you can get if you're displaying content on top of it. So that's the reason for saying display none for the carousel indicators. Okay, so that does it for the content on top of our image slider. So there's just a couple of other areas that we'll take a look at. Mainly the social icons, as I mentioned before, but also the heading that appears underneath the Jumbotron is quite large. So let's go ahead and take care of that, and then we'll move down to the social icons. So this, if you remember, is the display 5 class that we added. So it just has the one transition, I think, in the finished version, but we can add multiple because it's still kind of large on this screen width right here. So let's go ahead and grab the class for that, which is going to be h1.display-5. And then we'll give it a font size of 2.2 rem. All right, and then let's take a look at the change here. So if we refresh, there we have it a little bit smaller. So let's make another change at the 768 pixel mark. So we can just copy this and drop it down to the max width 767, and let's change that to 1.8 rem. And that looks good. And then if you want, you can make one additional adjustment to make it even smaller in the 575 media query. So I'll go ahead and just say 1.5 rem. Okay, so I think I'm on the finished version right now, but anyways, let's go ahead and drop down to the last bit of the content that we need to reduce, which will be the social media icons. Okay, so if we remember from the HTML, that was the social class that we added, and then the A. So that's going to be .social space A, and we'll add that in the 767 mark. And let's reduce the font size to 2.5 rem from, I think it was 4 rem originally. And then the padding, let's go ahead and reduce that from, I think it was 3 rem all around, down to 1.2 rem. And then let's save it. And that looks pretty good until we get down to really small screen width. So let's add one more breakpoint for the social media icon sizing in the 575 pixel width. So we'll say 2 rem and 0.7 rem for the padding. All right, and then if we save it and refresh, that looks pretty good. Okay, so you can go ahead and work through it to see if there's anything else you want to resize, but that's going to do it for us for all of the CSS and, as you know, the HTML. So I want to thank you for sticking around with me through this tutorial. Please remember to like this video, subscribe, and comment. Also, if you get the chance to, go ahead and check out my Udemy course on Bootstrap that's linked in the starter files and the description of this video. And if you do take the course, remember to send me a message and rate the course, and I'd appreciate that. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.